Up some of your commentary. I mean, I kind of someone who has traveled to many urban centers globally and understands it very well. Who's an architect. I'm the editor of our national architectural magazine, an urban designer, et cetera, and worked in many cities around the world. I kind of believe this working group, while it's has the global suburbanism in it, I think that the issue of suburb is really a name by convention only, and not by a definition of a type of urbanism. I think a suburbanism is a type of urbanism. I wouldn't say it's a sub, meaning secondary to or anything like that. I think it's just a way of life. And I think the issues of social capital, of the social, the political, the economic components that we find in our built environment is really what defines mission and purpose of architecture and urbanism. And that mission and purpose gives things authenticity. And decoding it is a difficult question. I think Sean has tapped on those issues, but the codification of authenticity that occurs in the suburbs, by nomenclature only, is in fact a very urban environment and a very urban condition that affects the range of human emotion and capacity that is no less or greater than what we would find in a downtown core. I think it's just a different issue. I'm Ian Chodikoff, and the editor of Canadian Architect Magazine. I'm also very interested in what happens in terms of social capital and what creates our urban environments. And in fact, I guess the confidence that I have and the strength of being an architect to understand buildings gives me the confidence to step back and say that if a building doesn't have those social and political purposes in it, it's not much of an architectural building. To reverse the kind of concept, if you have a gorgeous $500 million downtown cultural institution with little purpose to it, then what does that say for the architecture that's inside of it? It sort of becomes an empty icon, in a sense. So, but I'm here not to give a grand view, a grand theory about architecture, but to talk about tools and hopefully some resources and expectations that we can gather relating to inner and outer suburbs, specifically and specifically in relationship to cultural diversity and multiculturalism, and to try and find, as I sort of say here, to identify some issues of informality and simultaneity that exist within our built environment. I mean, this image here you see aspects of informality and simultaneity that exist. You have shops that are much more porous and fluid within a streetscape. You have a large, in this part of East London, a very large South Asian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi community, and you have a response in the background that's really catered to the cultural diversity of the community. But what happens when you're closer to home? And you're out in Mississauga, and you're not far from here, Ontario and Dundas, and you start seeing this kind of scenario. What is it that you see? I'm going to just try and make this a little bit bigger, just for clarification's sake. You start seeing aspects of things happening all at once. You have a person driving a bike, a visible minority, off to an employment center, we don't know where. You have for sale signs, you have informal and formal businesses happening, and you have a different kind of spatial arrangement that is not in a downtown core, like Sean had identified. In the downtown, there's a much more of a spatial orthodoxy in terms of dimensions. In the suburb, that orthodoxy is a bit shattered and scattered. The spaces become wider, and how do we kind of deal with that? But the expediency and things that are happening all at once are very interesting to me, and very much more present a much more globally connected, in some ways, reality than what we might see in a downtown core. Here you have a Sikh Gurdwara in the distance, portables. You can't really see in this photograph, but there's a layering of portables because the facility isn't big enough to handle an expanding Sikh population for kids to go to school there. And then you have this Mughal-inspired shopping mall in the foreground. So you have many things happening all at once that start to indicate an economic vitality, a cultural diversity, a political reality, and a social purpose. You know, or you have, you know, the name brand. Well, Blockbuster Video isn't really Blockbuster Video anymore. It's kind of gone way of a dinosaur, I guess, or going that way. The video store is going that way, you know. But, you know, you have this man out in front, outside, selling bootleg Indian Bollywood video cassettes, right? And you start having a conflation of society that's occurring. Or here, and also in Malton, the strip mall is so full that, you know, an entrepreneur has to then start to take over or absorb or go into traditionally residential side streets. So you start seeing mutations happening. Again, these are all sort of symptoms. Again, a symptom. This is over in Pacific Mall. Each of those yellow gas lines is a business, right? It's a business that is almost aspatial, but it's sort of framed around a kind of the sort of traditional take on a townscape that was sort of phase one of the Pacific Mall, of the Asian super mall that's evolving as we speak. This photo I like very much because it indicates an economic reality and a vitality that exists in a community, and in this case, an Asian community that is converging for the purpose of business, for connectedness, for social interaction, however you want to put it, if you are an economist or you are a sociologist or anthropologist. Again, this is where kind of me as the architect become interested in kind of hack anthropology, in a sense that you have, again, that simultaneity. We know where that Tim Hortons billboard sign is, but we're not always so keyed into the Hindu astrologer or where I'm going to get a sari for my daughter's wedding. So we have these signs in our urban environment that are maybe aspatial, but linked to centers. This traditional strip mall, but the signage is very different. And again, you're dealing with the non-spatial orthodox. We're not dealing with the non-spatial orthodoxy of the downtown. We're dealing with a suburb, and in some ways it's much more exciting because the fluid dynamics are much more interesting. But you also have the problems of polarization and enclaves. The first thing that people talk about when they think about multiculturalism in the suburbs is enclaves. You know, these people are going to live, in autonomous areas of the city. What are we going to do about it? But it's not necessarily the fact that it relates to issues of ethnicity or multiculturalism, but it relates to some of the basic services and keying into those services. Here we are at Jane and Finch, but there's 65 people in this image. Can't really see them here right now, but if you were to actually pick apart, and you stand on a busy street corner downtown, and 65 people will, you think that's sort of normal. You think, oh, no one walks around the street corner of Jane and Finch, but it's not true. But who are the people that stand around there? And it's a particular, you can start parsing it out in specific groups and also specific economic conditions, single mothers or other issues. And so you start seeing a different kind of spatial dynamic that's not responding to the population. There's a disconnect. But when you're dealing with large dimensions, that disconnect is hard to kind of narrow the gap, even though the social capacity is there. So it's a symptom, it's an issue. The Jane and Finch Mall, there's behind, it's pretty empty, but you have kind of clues of symptoms of things that are coming up where specific to these communities or communities around that need to deal with what kind of groups are there. Here we have on Bathurst Corridor a lot of Filipino nannies. There's a lot of there's a concentration of Jewish families and a lot of Filipinos that rent along the Bathurst Street corridor. So you have Western Union shops, Filipino bakeries, and you have kosher meat shops and bakeries as well. You have these polarization is a sort of a specific case study or example, but you have a polarization of nannies that exist in Bathurst Street corridor, and then as the Jewish community has largely, or not largely, but has grown more to the north of the city up in Thornhill, you start seeing similar behavioral patterns happening, but the space is very different. Even though this is an inner suburban space, in a suburban space you still see the sociological mechanisms carry forward. Where are those Filipino names? You know, it's a little harder again to spot, but the sociological mechanisms are there that still contribute to what we might fear as being an enclave, or we might fear as being polarization, but it's still there. You have the sign in the lower left, you can't really even see it, behind the minivan of the community synagogue. It's not much of a community out here, yet still street names are you know, sort of as Hebrew, Or Menachem Way, the light of, you know, Moses Way, in a suburban tract housing out in the middle of nowhere. But, you know, it's a different model than the Bathurst Street corridor, where you have kind of a Kensington market that's taken up north of Bathurst, and then when Bathurst goes to Thornhill, it becomes diluted again. But these mechanisms were still hanging on, and this is kind of the problems that I have, that we're not progressing far enough. That along the Bathurst Street corridor, you still seeing, how do we kind of bring the shtetl, bring the little Polish village origins of a Jewish community into a suburban area? Do you do it through mosaics, like we see here, through the mural routes have tried to develop? As you see, it's almost a kick plate beneath a guide, but on a busy sidewalk with a sushi restaurant along the Bathurst Street corridor. It's kind of trying to give token, trying to provide identity for a community, but it's not the best way we can do it. Sprawl. Obviously, these things exacerbate. We talk about these issues all the time, about where urban environments are going, but you know, what do we do in terms of understanding, repurposing spatial identities amidst sprawl, I guess is what we want to look at. And you see sprawl, 50 years ago, we had very progressive types of developments. On the left is the cover of Canadian Architect in the late 60s of a great housing development in Flemington Park. But the type of, the blonde white kid of 1968 is very different than today's reality of children that live out in the suburban areas of our cities. But there's a satellite dish, and there's a video game, and there's connectivity, there's internet. These kids could be as urban-minded as, in some ways, as they come in terms of understanding what the realities are, as far as what a 10-year-old boy can figure out. But the realities are very different than what the little boy experiences on the left. And we have to adapt to that and understand that despite the fact that we have sprawl, despite the fact that we have tract housing, despite the fact that we have alienation, how are we going to repurpose our world? This photo, which isn't too far from you guys out in the East End, is very interesting for me, because when this bridge was built, the designer did not consider, what's interesting is behind us, we have the largest, 48,000 people live in Thorncliffe Park, not where you guys live, but across the bridge and nearby. There's a series of towers that house almost 50,000 people, mostly South Asian origin, or high percentage. And when this bridge was built, it was no intention of having an Islamic pattern embedded onto that concrete bridge. But it's kind of fitting today. And when you look at this, where you're standing now, and you look at what the downtown means to you, spatially and culturally, it's a very different game. Because when you live in the suburbs, if we call them suburbs or whatever, we live in this type of urban environment where we're living in the highest concentration of Muslim Canadians in the country. We're more concerned about what's happening in Mumbai or in Dubai or Lahore than we are on Queen Street. So the urban environment, it's not that the urban-suburban the suburbanite yearns to be an urbanite. The suburbanite happens to be a global citizen as much as the global citizen downtown. It's just the frames of reference are completely different. And the unfortunate thing is that we need to redesign or reconsider these issues. So when your grandmother, well, not my grandmother, a grandmother is sitting in a 35 degrees Celsius heat waiting for the bus in a bus shelter in front of a Sikh temple, you start to think, well, this is a very global picture. It's a very globally connected world. Could be a very urban world if you want to frame it in those terms. Depends on your definition, but it's alienating.